All right, we've had a really great talk about all of these issues that are coming up in the coming months. I think that's great stuff for folks to take away and folks to consider, and possibly stuff that could be the center of future PINDROP episodes. Speaking of future PINDROP episodes, let's talk a little bit about what we're getting into this season, and then we'll also do a little bit of gentle reflection about the past season. So first of all, looking forward to this season. Our first episode is going to be Turkey. This is going to come out next week, actually. We are going to be speaking with Berk Essen, who is a Turkish professor, and he's actually written for the Brookings Institute before as well, and Mert Moral, who is also a Turkish professor. And both of these guys have a big emphasis on looking at authoritarian states. And I am looking forward to talking about Mert Moral specifically. I think I might be the only one talking with him, unfortunately. But he wrote a really interesting paper, which argues that when you look at dividing societies, the division is being driven by party leadership, not by voters, which I think is something I think about a lot here. Is the division that we see in the United States, is it the Republican Party voters telling the Republican leaders to be more divisive, or is it the other way around? And his argument in the paper is that it is the leaders who are making up this rhetoric to help improve their stats. So I think it'll be interesting to chat a bit about him with that, especially in the context of Turkey and its recent elections. A question I'll definitely want to pose to at least one of them is one that, Nick, you and I wanted to ask Dr. Julian Waller, but we lost the time to, about Poland, which is Poland was seen as an increasingly authoritarian country where I think some people would not have been too surprised if the popular will was genuinely for the opposition, but peace officially won. But that's not what happened. And I do wonder if we could have seen that in Turkey. Erdogan appears to have won his recent election fairly, but if he wasn't going to, what would the official results have been?
The other thing I think is really worth exploring in the Turkey episode is the PKK conflict, which has stepped up a lot.
I'll say as well, we put a poll up on our Instagram about these various big issues that Turkey faces, because it's a country that has a lot of big issues that are worth talking about. The one that most people said they knew the least about was Turkey's Kurdish minority.
That's like that's
these guys' thing.
Well, Diego more
that's
than
like my
me.
whole shtick. Yeah.
We should probably explain for our listeners that the PKK, Kurdish Workers' Party, is sort of a Kurdish nationalist guerrilla movement that's been active in Turkey since the 1980s, and there's an ongoing conflict there.
I mean, I won't get too into it, but basically it recently stepped up because there was a big escalation in like 2015, 2016 for reasons that I'm sure we'll expand more in the episode. I don't want to take too much time. Things have been kind of like going like the same for a while, where Turkey will just do some airstrikes in northern Iraq on PKK positions and sometimes on like northern Syria. But then recently on October 1st, I think the PKK did a suicide bombing, which they haven't done in a while, and it was in front of Turkey's Ministry of the Interior, injured 2 police officers. And it was the day that they were going back into session. So this prompted mass Turkish airstrikes in northern Iraq and in Rojava, northern Syria, where the YPG is a PKK-linked militia. So the situation has stepped up a lot. And as we've seen, it's had regional implications as it has expanded beyond Turkey, and
especially in Syria,
and also NATO implications with Finland and Sweden's NATO accession.
Absolutely. Erdogan's foreign policy, including what he's been saying about the Israel-Hamas war, is something I didn't expect us to talk about, but I think we will have to talk about.
Yeah, we should also talk about it.
Revanchist Turkey is always a lot of fun, very interesting stuff.
The other issue I'll add that's very recent breaking news as of this week is a constitutional crisis. There was an elected member of parliament who was convicted and imprisoned on the grounds of supporting a protest back in 2013, I think it was, and having won parliamentary election from prison, he argued, and the Constitutional Court agreed, that he now had a parliamentary immunity to be freed in order to serve his term as a member of parliament. But another high court in Turkey that isn't the highest, the Court of Justice, I believe, the Appeals Court of Justice, said that he could not be released. And so there is this ongoing conflict between whether or not this member of parliament is going to be released, with the highest court saying he must be, but the lowest courts that are most directly involved receiving direct orders from the Appeals Court of Justice to not release him.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that is something I didn't expect us to talk about. But
Maybe a bit of a preview for American presidential politics. Who knows?
It's,
honestly, it might be though.
It's like the Turkish Bobby Sands. Yeah. Interesting.
So Turkey's one episode. It's the one episode we are very much definitely doing. Let's talk about other countries that we may or may not cover that are leaning towards.
Well, Kurdistan. My favorite country.
Notice how he said country, folks. PINDROP World News officially endorses a free and independent Kurdish state. No, that is not officially our stance, but covering Kurdistan, I mean, long-time listeners will know that our definition of a country is not always very precise. We covered the European Union, and I'm probably the only person in this room who considers that a country. So...
you consider the European Union a country?
I basically do, but anyway,
boy.
that's a story for another time.
I was just joking around about the Kurdistan. I do hope that one day there is a country called Kurdistan. But I guess some background on myself. I did a lot of work with the Kurdistan regional governments in their consulate here. So did my colleague here, Nick Castillo. I did some solo travel through the region. I'm like a huge nerd about Kurdish politics, and I'm hoping to maybe get on some connections I have onto the podcast, and we can do an episode on Kurdistan that will mostly focus on Iraqi Kurdistan, which is always in a very strange strategic quagmire, being a huge friend of the U.S. and pretty pro-West, while Iraq is maybe less so. There are different factions within Iraq who feel differently about this. And then also being next to Iran, which has attacked them a lot in the past, either directly or largely through the PMF, its proxies there. Now with the war going on in Israel, this again places Kurdistan in a very interesting strategic position, especially since these Iran-backed militias are increasingly attacking the U.S. in the region, and since Iran in the past has connected, Israel to Kurdistan to try to justify attacks. A lot of the times when they have struck Erbil with missiles in the past, they said they were targeting Mossad bases in Erbil. So I don't know if it could be that Iran uses this situation with Israel as an excuse to step up activity there. I don't know. I think that part of the world is going to see a lot of activity, and I think it's a good time to talk about Kurdistan. Also, they're facing issues with the energy sector because Baghdad doesn't like that. In the past, they've tried to sell oil themselves, so
It's worth clarifying here that there is already nominally a Kurdistan, which is an autonomous region in northern Iraq. It's considered to be part of Iraq, but it has a greater degree of autonomy over its own operations. But the Kurdish people live not just in northern Iraq, but also in parts of Syria, in Turkey, and depending on who you ask, the vision of a Kurdistan as a free and independent country could look a little bit different.
When I talk about hoping that there is an independent Kurdistan one day, I'm largely just envisioning Iraqi Kurdistan.
An open invitation, if you are one of the 10 people in this country besides Diego who considers himself a nerd of Turkish politics, DM us on Kurdish politics. Apologies. There's a lot more Turkish politics nerds in this country. If you are one of those few people, feel free to DM us on our Instagram at pindrop.podcast, and we might enjoy having you on for a panel. Nick, you have an episode that you are really excited about doing in theory, assuming we can put it together and get some good experts on. And I have to say, I don't know if I've heard of an episode that I've been more excited for in concept. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yes, so it should be very exciting and very interesting. Diego and I are going to do work on it. We are considering doing an episode on the axis of resistance, which is to say the network of militia groups and quasi-state actors that the Iranians have propped up throughout the Middle East over the course of the last few decades. This is something that is talked about quite often in the news these days due to the war in Gaza with the Israelis and with Hamas, in part because probably one of, if not the most important of these axis of resistance members is Hamas itself, which receives weapons and funding and in part training from Iran and has very positive relationships with other members of the axis of resistance. The other, most noteworthy one being Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, but also the Houthis, and as Diego alluded to, a series of local militias in Iraq and Syria. The axis of resistance is one of the, big headaches for not just the Israelis but the United States, for the Kurdistan regional government, and for a lot of governments in the region as well. You know, the civil war in Yemen, infighting in Iraq, Assad's victory in the Syrian civil war. These were all things. Hezbollah, which is also active in Syria, and the most significant fighting Hezbollah has done since the Lebanese civil war is with the assistance they provided to the Assad regime. So really, even though technically it's not a country, one of the most significant factors in Mid-East politics. And hopefully we've got some good guests in mind that we can hopefully get on. And I think it'll be interesting and quite timely.
We'll not name drop, but it would be really awesome. We have some great ideas.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that episode. The other thing I have in mind, which I think I have discussed, look, I'll be honest, I'm a big Middle East guy. A lot of my episodes have concentrated on the Middle East, so I always like to try to diversify.
Your only solo episode so far has been the West Bank, after all.
Well, I did Nepal.
Oh, you did Nepal. Never mind.
So yeah, I do like to diversify my stuff a bit. So I'm very interested in doing an episode on Equatorial Guinea. This is a country that I also have a niche interest in. I mean, they've been ruled by the same guy since 1979. He was the nephew of this guy Francis Macias Nguema, who is like one of the most brutal dictators of all time that no one knows about. Like, it's pretty horrific. During his reign, half the population of Equatorial Guinea either was killed or fled, because he was like he was literally a psychopath. Like he would like go to Europe seeking psychological help because he was a psychopath. And I could go on about this. At one point, he had a bunch of dissidents put into a stadium, and he had guys dressed up as Santa Claus like execute them while this like famous song, I forgot what it's called, was playing. It's like just stuff where it's like this guy was like literally like a deranged psychopath. He defenestrated his own foreign minister. Like with it, he like threw his foreign minister out of a window. Like, he was insane.
Word of the day: defenestration.
My favorite word. After legume.
Well, there happens to be a window right here, Diego. Would you care to know?
We could, on air. But seriously though, it's in a very interesting position because it has a lot of oil, and that has drawn an interest from the U.S. and China, and it kind of tries to position themselves. And you know, the U.S. classic, they're like, yeah, authoritarian sucks and all unless you have natural resources, which I mean makes sense.
Fun facts about Equatorial Guinea, by the way. Only majority Spanish-speaking country in Africa.
That's where my interest in Equatorial Guinea came. I was taking a class on hip hop in Africa, and we had to take one class, and all these kids are being normies, doing like, I'm gonna do like Nigeria or South Africa, where there's like already such a big hip hop presence everyone knows about. I'm like, I'm gonna do Equatorial Guinea. I know some great Equatorial Guinean rappers like Jamin Dog and Mr. O. And yeah, I could maybe include some of their music on the podcast.
What if we could get them onto the podcast?
I'm actually considering reaching out to Jamin Dog, because Jamin Dog makes good music, and he like doesn't like the government. And like Equatorial Guinean rap is interesting because there's a lot of like, there are elements of like criticism of the government,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of rappers are actually in Spain, kind of because of that. But it's a very interesting country, and it doesn't get talked about a lot.
Listeners and viewers, I challenge you to find another source of English-speaking podcast media that would even consider trying to interview a Equatorial Guinean rapper. So, Good luck on that front. I'll say in terms of episodes I'm looking at, I think more likely than not, the first proper episode I'll be main producing is Thailand. Just so happens I'm scheduled to release one on the week of their national holiday. My brother, who we've had on the podcast before, has been to Thailand, and he'll be going to Thailand again in January. A lot of interesting events happening there. There was an apparent prime minister designate who, essentially, oversimplifying, won the popular vote, but because he actually needed support from senators who were pro-military, in the candidate, this particular candidate was very anti-military, meant he was unable to form a government. So rather than, what you might argue is an electoral college sort of way, the system worked in the way it was intended to, but that was not a particularly democratic system in an authoritarian country like Thailand. I think that would be one of the things that would be center stage if we were to cover Thailand. I'll also add, I am considering, and I haven't hit you guys with this idea yet before, but with Argentine elections coming up, I think it might be interesting to start something where if we have a particular world event, especially elections that come up, it might be fun to do a little short thing where we could get an expert on, and rather than our typical hour-long videos, just do something relatively shorter, 10, 15, 20 minutes, talking about here's an important event, here's what you need to know, here's a little bit of guest interpretation. So if we did that, I have some Argentinian contacts who I think could be quite good, possibly political commentator or one of the newly elected representatives for the legislature. Yeah, that's something possibly that we could start, and if you're interested in that, make sure to let us know in the comments.
And I guess now that we're on South America, I think the other country we did talk about was Colombia. I mean, I believe there have been developments with the issue with the FARC. They just had some elections, and it seems like it was a pretty big win for the right wing. Although I will say that all my information about Colombia comes from my friend Nick Camargo, who we might have as a guest. You will be very familiar with this man because
I am very familiar with him despite having not met him.
He has very strong opinions on Colombia, and just on like anything having to do with like combating leftism or communism. You'll see. And if we do, I am hoping to do an episode in Colombia, and we will absolutely bring on Nick Camargo. I think, Yeah.
I can't imagine he would say no.
Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. Well, he's shown strong interest in coming on. He does have connections in Colombia. Yeah. It'll be a good time. It'll be a good time. So Colombia is the other one I have on.
Okay. Any others that you want to discuss about potential episodes? Because I don't have any more that are like, I think are pretty concrete. Oh, besides Ukraine.
We were thinking
In
this is something
February.
perhaps we could preview for our audience. This coming February, it'll be the second anniversary of the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And given the fact that we have a number of good contacts on Russia, Ukraine, Eurasian issues, we are hoping to be able to put together a roundtable discussion where we would focus on the war so far, looking to the future. One thing I would love to be able to focus on actually in that episode, and there are one or two guests I'm hoping to have on, is trying to figure out what exactly is happening within the occupied territories of Ukraine. What is life like there? Because that's something that it's very hard to get information on in the West. And there's a number of writers who have delved into it, and I'd love to be able to try to get them on. But just broadly speaking, that would be sort of a major event for us, a pretty lengthy conversation, most likely, focusing on what still probably remains the most important news story going around at the moment, even though Israel-Hamas gets a lot more attention nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that does it for sort of previews for the upcoming season in that respect. I'll add a couple more. We will be launching a website very soon, like possibly by the time this video is uploaded, it will already be live. This will include mostly blog pieces that will either accompany episodes that we have. For instance, you'll be able to find a piece on El Salvador that talks a little bit as a complement to the episode we did on El Salvador. There's one as well as one about the West Bank. And stuff that doesn't actually get published in episodes. We will invite guests on. In fact, if you yourself have a hot take about world news, you can definitely DM us, and we might be interested in taking your piece on for the blog. Besides the blog aspect, it'll sort of have maybe some references to other world news events and articles that aren't even ours that we think would be quite relevant for people to consider. A little bit more information like that, how to access our podcast episodes, so forth and so forth. I think that's it in terms of the previews that we have. Can you all think of anything else, or should we head on to sort of some light reflection on the past season?
That was pretty good.
You can head on, yeah.
So I'll start by saying, since I never addressed this very directly, I had the privilege of coming on the PINDROP show when it was with WRGW back in the fall of 2022. The creator, Ian Kearns, who we still give credits to at the end of every episode, took me on as an intern, and I was really happy to just run with this show. And working with Ian, we took it from something where there was about 2 hours of research beforehand and it was bullet points just talking about events, to a proper show where we would have a scripted introduction to issues, we'd have a good guest on, and we'd have a student panel. And when I graduated, the show wasn't going to be continuing, and I had it in the back of my head that I might try to continue it, but I didn't find a great motivation to do that in a lot of ways, trying to look for proper jobs and so forth. But at some point I talked with Nick at first, and you had already come on the show as a panelist and talked about how much you enjoyed it, and it sort of reminded me of how enjoyable this process was. And so I got together with Nick and Diego, and they really provided, I think, that motivation. I think we motivate each other to kind of make this into a show that we have continued now into what you have just witnessed, which it was its third season, and now going into the fourth season. I'll say, reflecting back, that we did an internal poll of 3 people, and our favorite episodes as producers were El Salvador and the West Bank. I'll also add that our best performing single piece of content was actually a bonus content we produced for the Polish 2023 elections with Dr. Julian Waller, and by we I mean Nick Castillo specifically. I'll say about the El Salvador episode, because I think chronologically that was the first one that we are highlighting here. I freaking loved our guest, Mayor Will Salgado. I really was struggling to find a good guest for El Salvador. He responded with interest, and I remember looking into him. This guy's on the Angels list, which is a State Department kind of list of people who do illegal things related to drugs and financing.
Least corrupt El Salvadorian politician.
He is the mayor of the second largest city in El Salvador. He fought during the Civil War, faced trial, was acquitted, ran for president. He just has a fascinating history, and it was really cool to talk to him because he came off as a very down-to-earth guy who didn't have very complex answers to his questions and was really not trying to dodge things. When I asked him, for example, about Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and his crackdown on crime and gangs, and the corresponding concerns about lacking due process, innocent people possibly getting swept up in the process, his response was just, this is a war against gangs. All wars have collateral effects. In Vietnam, some of those bombs killed innocent people too. And now, I think we could debate all day whether that justifies what's happening, but that is a sort of blunt answer, and he was very direct with that. I don't know if you will have any highlights of El Salvador as well, besides, we didn't have video sadly, but Diego looked like Nayib Bukele at the time of the recording by coincidence.
AJ was just nice enough to buy me a Nayib Bukele t-shirt because I am a pretty big fan of Nayib Bukele. So I appreciate
the most
that,
popular world leader among his citizens.
Yeah.
I'll say that my favorite thing about the El Salvador episode is our foray into multilingual interviews. I thought that was very cool.
Yeah.
And very impressive editing and translation on your guys' part.
Thank you. That was so time-consuming, but also very rewarding to be able to do that, because the interview with Will Salgado had to be conducted in Spanish because he doesn't know English, and Diego was kind enough to help me with translation and doing the voiceover for his part. And heck, if we do Argentina, that might be something, or Colombia.
Guinea.
That might, or Equatorial Guinea. Yeah. If we do a lot of episodes that involve a language we already speak, which I think would be Spanish, maybe Russian.
My Russian's a little too conversational for high-level political discussion.
Okay, fair enough. But it's something we can hopefully do in the future, and I think it's a fun process too.
Yeah.
I always like thinking about, should I do the literal translation, like this is literally what that word means, or should I do the cultural translation? Like you don't say vale la pena, you don't say worth the pain, you just say worth it, because that's what you would say in English.
Yeah.
West Bank was a really cool episode, and one that was long in the making. Diego, talk us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually interviewed our first guest, Avi Melamed, from Jerusalem. And yeah, I mean, I studied over there in Jerusalem. I was there about 8 months. I traveled extensively throughout Israel proper and the West Bank. I mean, so of course they just had a very big interest in doing it. It was fascinating. I mean, one thing, my favorite thing about the show is just how willing experts are to just come and talk to a bunch of college students about what they're doing. I mean, we got really good guests. Avi Melamed was, I think, one night.
I'll interrupt there briefly just to add. I really think that is the single best guests that the two combined.
Yeah.
That we have had on the show.
I agree. It was. I mean, I think one of the things I placed the most importance on in that episode was getting two guests from, I guess, polar opposite viewpoints. I don't know if polar opposite is the right
And the conflicts of this conflict, maybe not quite.
Because I did consider both guests, even though they had fundamental disagreements, to be like very reasonable people when it came to discussing the conflict. But still, people who come from two different communities, you're dealing with a deeply divided society, and I don't think you can accurately, I don't think you can make a good episode on Israel-Palestine without having an Israeli guest and a Palestinian guest. Or at least a Jewish guest and an Arab guest. I think that's why when we interviewed Dr. Lazarus, which was another one of my favorite interviews, we also prioritized getting Dr. Janab Tutunji, who himself was a very good guest. But yeah, the West Bank was definitely my favorite episode to work on. It was just so cool being like, I can't believe I'm talking to these people. Avi Malamed was like a Mossad agent, and he was like the Minister of Arab Affairs to two Jerusalem mayors, one of whom went on to become like the Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, during the first and second Intifadas. That was like fascinating that this guy is just willing to talk to me. And then like the Deputy Ambassador of Palestine to the UN. That's like a that's a good
Feda Abdelhadi Nasser.
And both of them,
they were both also well spoken for radio.
Yeah, both
definitely
very good guests. I also loved working on the Nepal episode because another thing I've loved about the show is that a lot of these countries, like Israel, luckily Israel, Palestine, I had a lot of knowledge on already, but Nepal, I knew nothing about Nepal. And something fascinating is just approaching a country that I know absolutely nothing about and being able to become kind of like an amateur expert on it and like pretty well versed on it and talk to pretty good guys. Like Santosh was a good guest. He leads like a Nepalese think tank, and Michael Kugelman was an amazing guest. Very good on the mic, working for the Wilson Center, like pretty big mahir, you know, for like writing about South Asia. And I think they were both very solid interviews. And now I know about Nepal, and I have my own conspiracy theories on the Nepalese royal family massacre,
which was crazy. We didn't talk about it.
I wish we had more time to talk about that, but yeah.
Unfortunately, we're already over on time, but I will let you, Nick, if you have any brief comments about Poland, because I do think that was a great episode, and we didn't try to give it as much attention, but I really think it was quite solid.
Yeah, I think both of the
and
guys...
your script writing as well. I loved your script writing.
Oh my god, thank you so much. I have to say I was very happy with the script for that. I was happy with both of our guests as well. I found them both to be quite dynamic speakers who were able to bring insights that I didn't really expect. Speaking with Cordelia Buchanan-Ponchik, who I was most familiar with as a writer on Polish issues particularly, she had like a wonderful understanding of the European Union that I really appreciated. Framed the European Union as this big sort of intangible organization, a little bit like that story of the three blind men and the elephant, which I quite like.
Not its own country.
And I quite like the way she described the European Union. And then Dr. Julian Waller, who is a personal friend and a former professor, I always enjoy speaking with him. I find him, if you want to talk about East Europe, if you want to talk about liberalism, I find him to be one of the most insightful, heterodox, and also quite dynamic speakers on that topic. So it's always a pleasure for me to speak with him.
Something very pleasant they both brought was also that context, kind of like you said, not just knowing Poland, which sometimes can happen if you talk to decision makers or the wrong kind of or particular kind of people, but also being able to provide the context of what neighboring countries are like and so forth. Alrighty. Thank you so much for listening, folks, and watching. This has been a nice overview of some of the news stories that we're looking at, a reflection on our past season and what we're looking forward to in this future season. If you have any ideas or stuff that you would like to see, please feel free to DM us on Instagram at pindrop.podcast or just leave a comment in this video or podcast episode. Thank you very much, and we'll be seeing you in just a week or so.